أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajah. Respected sisters, dear brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you for joining us once again in our series, Life, the Islamic Answer. For around 12 lectures, or around a dozen lectures, we have been discussing the role of the intellectual in the Islamic community of knowledge. And we began the discussion by explaining the importance and the relevance of this topic in general, but really and more specifically for us as minorities living in the West, trying to establish communities in general and communities of knowledge specifically. We said that the idea of the intellectual or the figure of the intellectual has not always existed. There's a time when today we can go back with what we know today and say there might have been people who fit the description of the intellectual in history, but there was no real phenomenon or figure or entity that was recognized as such before. And we said the reason for this is that the social reality did not require for that type of person to exist and that type of role to exist in the past in society, even though there are people who may have fit that description in the past. And so when we go looking through history, we see that the emergence of this figure begins in the West, and then slowly starts to spread across the world, because the conditions that led, not all of them, but in part, the conditions that led to the emergence of this figure in the West are the same, at least those that are common, they're the same to the ones that led to the emergence of the figure elsewhere in the world. And there was a little bit of a cause and effect, a little bit of a domino effect, where it was no longer possible to live as though you're completely isolated from the realities happening in the West, which opens the door to the whole discussion on globalization, and we see how far back it had actually started. So that what happens in one part of the world, especially if it's a part that has an influence, a lot of interaction with, or a relationship with, some sort of relationship with other parts of the world, that of course you're going to find some sort of presence of that phenomenon and reality elsewhere in the world too. And so we started to look at the conditions in the West that specifically led to the emergence of this figure. And there are a number of them. We're not going to summarize all of it. The point of today's lecture is simply to draw the conclusions from that entire discussion and wrap up this topic, inshallah, to move on to the next topics. We said that in the West, there is a number of factors that had already started in the medieval ages that culminated and reached a climax that resulted in a full rebellion against the traditional worldview and the traditional principles upon which that world, in Europe especially, was built. And in general, it was a rebellion against some of the principles feeding two main realities, which were the state and the church. But there's a whole foundation that allows those two entities to exist and to have the type of relationship that they had. And this was a rebellion against that entire network of ideas and principles and theories and beliefs, and a full rejection of them to be replaced by something else. And in general, this is what is referred to as the Enlightenment. There are principles and values that started to emerge at that point in Europe in the 17th and 18th century, depending on where you're looking in Europe, where you start to see that these principles are starting to be replaced by other ones. Now we are a lot more focused on reason, rationality, on science, on the human being, and therefore the rights of the human being, the freedoms of the human being as an individual, and what type of society we need to allow for those things to take hold and to become the ruling principles of that world, as opposed to the church/state combination that used to exist before, with a system of kings and queens and princes and everyone who relies on that type of political system, which was enabled, and so there was a very strong relationship by the church. So the church allows the state to exist, and the state allows the church to exist, and they both feed off of each other. And this is a system that those societies, those who lived in that world, started to consider as being oppressive, regressive, encumbering or hindering the growth of the human being as an individual, as societies. There's a lot of oppression happening, a lot of people living well below the line of poverty. They're simply being used and abused by this type of system. So this was kind of the foundation and the drivers behind this rebellion. And the West starts to move away from all of that. And then we saw that in the Islamic world, there's a whole series of events that also took place where we cannot really say that there's a break or a rebellion against the traditional worldview, but a lot of the principles and ideas of enlightenment started to be accepted elsewhere, including in the Islamic world too. Here we could open a small bracket and say, and perhaps in the Islamic world, when you are being presented with ideas that are supposed to be the latest, most modern, most revolutionary, and you take a look at them and you see that, in fact, these are not only entirely compatible with your belief system, in fact, you believe that your system and your worldview already includes all of these, you're not going to reject those. You're going to be a lot more open to accepting them, and this perhaps contributed to how quickly some of these ideas spread in the Islamic world, closing the bracket. And so in the Islamic world, there's a whole series of events and realities that started to happen that led to a lot of the same factors and drivers leading to the emergence of the figure of the intellectual in the West to also emerge in the Islamic world. In part, in the West, we also mentioned and we talked about what it means to move towards from enlightenment to modernity. Modernity is a very long series of cumulative changes in society and in the general worldview of the people who live in them, up until, the 1900s, where there was slowly a rejection of modernity to be replaced by something beyond it, which was called post-modernity, which we didn't really talk about. Okay, so with modernity, there is a set of ideas and beliefs and a worldview that also starts to emerge, and it's the complement of the principles of the Enlightenment. And of course, in the West, the major events are going to include many wars, including World War I, World War II, the Cold War, people reacting to those wars in the 50s and 60s and 70s, these social movements all around the idea of human rights and social equality and humanity and so on and so forth. And of course, in between all of that, especially if we look at the world stage, not just specifically in Europe or the US, there's an industrial revolution, there's the Russian Revolution that leads to Marxism appearing and becoming extremely influential all over the world. We spoke about colonialism and post-colonialism and or decolonization that emerged or was a reaction to colonialism and what had happened after World War I and World War II. And we already mentioned globalization and then the information age. So each one of these milestones leads to, if we wanted to, we didn't spend too much time on this, but if we wanted to, look at what society was viewing the role of the intellectual to be. Each one of these milestones is contributing to that. So today, the figure of the intellectual includes all this accumulation of ideas over all of this trajectory and development of historical, social, political transformations in society in the West. And then when we look at the parallel timeline happening in the Islamic world, perhaps the biggest socio-political, perhaps cultural milestone or change was the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Combined with the realization, when Napoleon appears suddenly on the shores in Egypt, that as a civilization, as a Islamic community, we have fallen very, very far behind, to the point where we're no longer an equal power to power. We're unable to defend ourselves. And we are very quickly falling into complete domination by others. And as time went by, that general realization was further corroborated and confirmed by many events. The more events took place, the more those who cared, those who are thinking, those who are experiencing and watching, realize that we're actually falling even more behind as every day goes by. And this was clear at the military level, this was clear at the scientific level, at the industrial level, at the economic level, at the political level. Wherever you look, you see that you have fallen way behind. When there was a time when you were the dominant force in the world, you ruled the world. And then suddenly it's like you wake up and you find yourself that far behind. So what happened? And this is where, you could add to that the state of colonialism. So while in the West they had dominated the world, they were the ones colonizing. In the Islamic world, they were the ones colonized. So that was part of the new reality of the Muslims now, that they were entirely colonized, under domination, under subjugation, and so on and so forth. There was the move towards what was called Nahda, but which was followed by a Naksa and a Nakba. So this was the attempt at revival. And we said that the initial attempt at revival was very much secular. And if you go back to the history of the Islamic world, you see those movements. What the Shah of Iran was trying to do, what those who were ruling Turkey right after the fall of the Ottoman Empire were trying to do. You see that in the Islamic world. There's a very big movement towards secularism. We're going to imitate what happened in the West. And this was happening at a very political level and happening in a very military style. You had a lot of military powers in control of those states, imposing this secular worldview. Otherwise, generally speaking, the Muslim society would not have accepted this. This was going against the will of the masses. Whereas in the West, this was supposed to be a reflection of the will of the masses. So that's why in the West you have democracies, and in the East you have completely authoritarian regimes. And the more time went by, the more this started to contribute to this idea that we have indeed truly fallen behind, including at the political level. We no longer have a voice. We are ruled by those who seem to have very different interests than those of their own societies. In any case, so after the secular reform movements, there was a reaction to them. Those who have studied Islam, political Islam, activist Islam in the past few decades, always link it to this, that there were attempts at secular movements of revival in the Islamic world, but they failed miserably. And this is what led to the emergence of much more aggressive, much more intentional and strategic and well-planned Islamic movements of reform, Islamic attempts at revival. This was in reaction to the attempts that had happened before that were considered to be complete failures by the masses in the Islamic world. And so that's why they supported the alternative. We tried the secular movements, and we saw the horrible results that became the realities of our lives. So we're going to no longer accept going back to that. Let's try something different. And this is when the Islamic movements of revival began in all sorts of different shapes and forms throughout the Islamic world. And some of them much more successful than others, some of them much more influential than others, and so on and so forth. So from all of this, we see that the main concern in the Islamic world was a little bit different than the one that the West was dealing with. In the Islamic world, the main concern was about revival and reform. And so when they think about the figure of the intellectual, it's entirely related to that lens, that perspective. What is this figure of the intellectual going to play as a role in any attempt at reviving Islamic society or at reforming either society or religion, depending on where people fell in the spectrum of what needs to be reformed and revived? Is there something wrong with the religion itself? Because there were some voices that claimed that, and they were in the minority and they continue to be in the minority. Or is there something majorly wrong with, lacking, distorted in the Islamic societies, the people who are trying to implement Islam? But in fact, they are not. And so the issue is, what do we do to reform the people and to reform the society, not to reform religion? Or does religion also need a reform? So that's the debate in which those thinkers are trying to place the role of the intellectual. To say, well, this is where the intellectual is active, this is their role, this is the scope of their activities, and so on and so forth. When we looked at all of this, and we looked at a very long series of thinkers in the West, we saw that we were able to kind of combine and group a lot of the issues and ideas and observations and insights into three main themes where a lot of the thinking seems to be centered. The first theme is power structures. The second theme was the skepticism and criticism towards intellectuals. And the third one is engagement, political and other type of engagement and activism. The idea of the power structures, we said, was also a novel idea in the West. This was a very modern way of looking at society and now understanding the notion of power in a different way. It has existed for centuries, teaching, the ruler how to maintain power, right? Many thinkers and philosophers and political theorists have written about this in history. But now we had thinkers and philosophers who are applying much more methodical, accurate tools to society to show that the notion of power can actually be analyzed, described, studied much more accurately than previously thought. And therefore, within that, the intellectual must play a role. The intellectual's role cannot be ignored in this idea of power. The structures of society, those who hold the ability to influence others, to dominate others, to change things in society, or to maintain the status quo in society, these are all power levers. And the intellectual is playing a very clear role in there. And so one, we want to understand what the role is, and two, what role should the intellectual play now that we know that there are these types of power structures. And we saw that there's a lot of thinkers who spend a lot of time on these ideas. And of course, there's a link here between this discussion and the moral dimension of it. At one layer, today, if you want to study this, you would study it from a sociological point of view. There's no morality. It's just describing the situation, understanding where power resides and how do you go towards power. So some of the biggest sociologists in the world have focused on this without telling you this is right or wrong. All they're trying to do is to give you the tools to analyze so that you understand, where does power lie and why does it lie there? And how do I know that this is where it lies? I can look at others and I see, where do they converge? Everything seems to be converging towards the centers of power, because the closest you are, the more power you end up having. So, sociologists will call this, for instance, symbolic power. If you associate with certain symbols, or you can display them in the very superficial sense or in the very deep sense, then of course you are closer to power, including, for instance, the language you use. Depending on the language you use, you place yourself in a circle of power, closer or further away from the center of power. Right? And this applies to any community, any society. This is one example. We could use many. The brands we wear, the books we read, the behaviors in society in general could also all be explained this way. That generally speaking, everyone wants more power, and those who have it want to preserve it. So you start to see the patterns in that. And then you can apply that to any specific area in society. You can apply that in a setting of, let's say, scientists working in a university context. You can apply that at the level of politicians. You can apply that the masses. You can apply that in the family. You can apply that, and that's what they do in sociology. Without ever saying, and this is right or this is wrong. There's no morality. But these thinkers who are thinking about the role of the intellectual added that layer, because their thinking is that we cannot stop short here of answering that question, or at least asking that question. What is the right thing to do here for the intellectual now that we know all of this? Is it all neutral and everyone can do whatever they want? Or do you now realize that you're always contributing to something? You have to be aware of what you're contributing to. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to that, inshaAllah. That there are economic, political, ideological interests, and everything that you do and every activity that you're contributing to is contributing to these interests, and so on and so forth. There was a second theme here related to what we call skepticism and criticism. And we saw that, generally speaking, perhaps the expectation is that there would be a lot more positive attitudes towards the intellectuals. But when we go back and we look at the majority of the thinkers and what they had to say about intellectuals in general, either historically or as a notion, intellectuals, their position is better described as either skepticism, they're not fully critical, it's not a fully negative position, or some of them were outright very critical of the figure of the intellectual for all sorts of reasons. And we went through many of them, that they are elitist, that they are disconnected from society, that they never have any real skin in the game, that there are no repercussions and consequences to their theories if they completely fail and they are, completely miss reality. We went through a lot of these. And so at the end we saw that there's a lot more of a critical attitude towards intellectuals than a positive one. And in the last theme, we looked at the idea of the engagement of the intellectual, engagement as in, being active, taking position on social issues, political issues, should they engage or not? And historically, have intellectuals been engaged or not? And we saw that both positions exist. There are those who say the intellectual must remain completely neutral, and the only way to do that is to never themselves become engaged in anything, as though they are self-appointing themselves as the objective, neutral judge on everything, and my role is only to describe and give you a objective, fair description because I have no skin in the game, so I have no bias. So you're going to respect my authority because I remain unbiased in this way. And then there are those, and we said in recent times, the one who was leading the charge and who became the most influential here is Chomsky. But many others like him, Sartre and others who spent a lot of time on this idea of the need for the intellectual, the necessity for the intellectual to be politically engaged, socially engaged, to believe in the ideas and the theories that they put forward, their descriptions of what is happening, their assessment of reality, and to do something about it. In the words of Chomsky, he says that intellectuals are in a very privileged position in society. No one else has the privileges that they have. And so privilege must always come with responsibility. You cannot have the privilege and not be responsible more than someone else for having that privilege. The tools you have access to, the positions you hold, the influence you have, the type of work that you do, the access to information that you have, all of that should lead to an expectation from society that you are going to play a different role than the person who just has to wake up in the morning and go to work fixing cars, for instance. This is not their job. It's your job to do this type of thinking and to raise the awareness and to take position and to lead the charge in society, right? So many other intellectuals participated in these ideas, and we saw the full spectrum when we spoke a little bit about it quickly. In the Islamic world, we went through a very long list of thinkers, many of them very quickly, but I think the point here was, one, to simply raise our own awareness to know that all of this thinking, and this is not even the tip of the iceberg, but all of this thinking is taking place in the Islamic world, that this is a world of ideas that is much more dynamic than we may think. A lot is happening. It's very rich. There's a lot of back and forth between these thinkers. They agree on some things. They completely disagree on others. And we can start drawing different schools of thought, different streams, right, of ideology and worldview in there. But all of it contributes to the general understanding that the Islamic world has given a lot of importance to the idea of the intellectual, the figure of the intellectual, as part of its attempt at revival, civilizational revival, social revival, Islamic revival, however you want to call it. And here there is a few main ideas that also emerged. The first one is that there's a realization of the need for a reform. That already needs to be spelled out and needs to be explicitly stated. There is a consensus. There is no one who wrote saying there is no need for a revival. Even those who are perhaps coming from the most conservative, intellectually speaking, most conservative of backgrounds, like the Salafis, for instance, they were the first to call for a reform. But their reform is to go back to purely Salafist thinking and principles. No one who thought about what is going on in the Islamic world disagrees with the necessity for a reform. The state in which we find ourselves as an Islamic community, as an Islamic world, is in dire need of a reform. There is consensus on this. This is very important to keep in mind. So that if today, when you hear some voices, some opinions, people saying, that things are okay and if you give it time, things will improve, and this does not match any analytical work, studying, description by anyone from any field, from any angle that has looked at these types of realities. No one has landed on the conclusion that we're actually doing okay. And there is no absolute urgent, immediate, crisis that we're dealing with, and it's getting worse every moment. We keep falling back even more all the time, right now, as it's happening in real time. Okay, so there's an awareness about how do we think as a society or as a civilization? What makes us think in this way? What makes us view ourselves and our place in the world and the things we give importance to and where we put our energy and where we want to move and what we're fixated on? All of these things, of course, are contributing to our reality. So a lot of time and energy was spent analyzing all of this. And that's why we found a number of our thinkers, and this is me now drawing the conclusions and drawing the themes out. As we went through them, maybe not all of them used the same terms, but many of them were saying the same thing. It's not that we have been colonized, it's that we have become colonizable. We are inviting others to colonize us, so of course we will be colonized. We can't start the discussion as we have been colonized. All things being equal, someone just came and colonized us. It's not as simple as that. Yes, someone came to colonize me. to dominate, to use and abuse of. All of that is true. But didn't I create the conditions for that to take place? And if I did not do that actively, my indifference to certain realities, my not doing anything about it, by me not modernizing, updating myself, staying current while all the others around me are doing that, that by itself makes me colonizable. This is the natural evolution of things. Right? This is how the world works. So all of that leads to the need for a revival. Otherwise, it's stagnation or falling back or backwards. The second theme that emerges from what we looked at when we went through the Muslim or Islamic thinkers is the importance of a very deep understanding of religion and specifically certain notions within religion. You probably noticed that some of the notions kept coming back again and again as we went from one thinker to another. So I'll mention 3 of them very quickly. One of them was the Holy Quran. And this, inshallah, I don't need to talk too much about. The last point today is to talk about our own communities and what needs to happen. The Holy Quran certainly emerges as one of the main themes when they were talking about understanding what needs to be understood, the type of knowledge that we have. There was a concentration of efforts from different angles that the Quran needs to be better understood. We have to do a better job understanding it, linking its teachings together, finding ways to apply those teachings to our lives in a real, deep, serious way, not in the superficial way. And all of these thinkers are talking at a very serious level. The cliches and the superficial understanding doesn't work here anymore. That's exactly what they say has been the issue. And that's why some of them started to go towards the need for new tools to reinterpret. We have to find a way, if the general classic interpretation has not helped, then there's something wrong with our interpretation. We have to go deeper. We have to use tools that are much more modern, that allow us to better translate this into our realities and our needs as societies. And so you'll remember, for instance, Fadl al-Rahman and others who spent a lot of time on this idea, and they've written a lot about it. That's one. There's also some specific themes that emerged. The biggest one, I think, that came up again and again, there's a few of them, but the biggest one was, of course, the theme of Tawheed. So this is also bringing us back to the idea that they're basically saying there's a lack of general, deep understanding of the spirit of our religion. This is what these thinkers are saying. They keep saying that there is a lot of technical knowledge about the details of religion, but the spirit of religion, it's being missed. It's not alive in the Islamic world. The spirit of this religion is missing. We're not seeing it. We see technical details, but we're missing the main picture, the big picture, the main drivers, the main reasons, the main raison d'etre, as they say, of a lot of the teachings that we have. What was the initial driver? What did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want humanity to understand from this teaching that He introduced it in this way in religion? It's not about the prayer specifically. It's about the benefits that you get from the prayer. It's not about paying the zakah. It's understanding the deeper philosophy behind the zakah, and so on and so forth. Right? So there was a lot of discussion there, and we saw how they started to link it to notions like maqasid al-sharia, the higher level objectives behind the teachings in Islam, whether it's law or elsewhere. And Tawheed, we said, which was kind of overarching. Most of the thinkers who spoke about these ideas spoke about the importance of Tawheed. Many of them spoke about the importance of the spiritual dimension in Islam. And again, all of this, inshallah, we keep in mind when we talk about our communities so that I don't repeat. Their general observation is that true spirituality is missing. We are focused on certain teachings of the religion, But true spirituality, where you truly connect with God and with other human beings the way God wants you to, it's not there. Which means that something went wrong. In our understanding and our application of this religion, we went wrong somewhere. We're trying to identify the root causes, right? So that I can fix them in what I call the revival or the reform. The reform is finding those things and fixing them. So therefore, I need to do something to reintroduce spirituality in my understanding and application of my religion. It cannot just be the rituals. There has to be something that I experience and that I feel that I can call spirituality, right? The spiritual dimension. And this is where they said that this is where an Islamic worldview or an Islamic paradigm, an understanding of the world disconnects completely from the Western one, right? This is where most of them said, this is where you see the full contradiction. Islam is about that spirituality. Everything else is supposed to lead to that so that you serve God and serve others in the best way. This is not the intent behind the Western philosophy or the secular sciences and knowledge network that has been created. The third theme that emerged is the importance of an educational reform. And this is something that we saw, I'm going to say pretty much every single thinker that we spoke about in one way or another spoke about the educational reform that is needed. And some of them did not go very far in what that meant, and some of them went very far. So some of them, well, first, even before we say what they were doing, we saw that for some of them, that was the main reason why Muslims fell behind, and that was the one thing to fix. There's other details, but if you can fix the educational system, then you will have fixed the majority of the issues, the main issues, and the Islamic world, the Islamic civilization will be put back on track and things will start to improve right away, right? Rifa'at Tahtawi and Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani in their initial writings, they were focused on that. And so we start to see that there are those who simply said, all we need to do is to start integrating those beneficial elements of knowledge and science that we find in the West, just integrate them into Islamic education systems. Especially, some of them added, in our religious schools, so that we have religious scholars who also have all the good, objectively good, beneficial sciences that come to us from the secular, non-Islamic world. And here they were mainly talking about things that lead to better industry, military, economics, so on and so forth. Natural sciences. So that was a theme. Integrating more of the non-Islamic education elsewhere in the world, integrating into Islamic education. We saw, therefore, afterwards in practice, that while some were not saying integrate, we saw that they were integrating in practice. We encountered many thinkers who they're not telling the Muslims to integrate, but in the way they approach this question and the tools that they use, the examples of Shari'ati, the examples of, you could see that they're directly drawing from secular, non-Islamic sources of knowledge and applying them to these same issues that we're dealing with. Fadl al-Rahman, Arkun, Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd, all of them, they were using non-Islamic tools and sources of knowledge to feed this specific discussion on Islam. And many of them spoke also about, therefore, once you have that type of knowledge, the role of the intellectual becoming the bridge between civilizations, between cultures, between religions. Many of them spoke about that. They are best positioned to play that role, to make both sides understand each other better, to negotiate, to release tensions, to so on and so forth. Then we have those who went much further. And they said, no, this entire system of knowledge is un-Islamic. It breaks with, it contradicts, it goes against Islamic knowledge. Therefore, we need to get rid of all of that and replace it with an entirely new set of knowledge, tools, and disciplines that we call truly Islamic, And we saw a lot of that with this project of the Islamization of knowledge, with Faruqi and Al-Attas and a few others who spoke about it. And by the way, I completely adhere to that, but there are a lot of conditions that need to be added here. There's a way to completely rethink. It's not the data, it's not the small details and the small elements, the micro elements within every discipline that are problematic. It's the ultimate intent behind the theories, the big theories that run and they become the philosophy of a science, the philosophy of physics, the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of astronomy. These natural sciences, what they're supposed to lead to, there's a way to frame them Islamically, and there's a way to lead them, to frame them in a completely non-Islamic, non-theistic way. Right? In any case, this would require a completely different discussion. And then we saw here a whole discussion on the need to develop expertise. And this goes in two main directions. One of them is to develop expertise for the scholars of religion in non-religious matters, and for the non-religious experts to have a much better understanding of religious sciences, so that we can actually bring them closer together, because we can see that there is a need for both if we hope ever to achieve any type of revival. We need religious scholars with much more understanding of how the world works so that they can better apply religion to it. And we need non-religious experts, they are experts but not in religion, to have a much better understanding of religion so that they can feed into that discussion and apply what they know of religion into their day-to-day work and lives and influence in general. Without both, you can't hope to achieve any revival. And from what we looked at, the best example would be the work or the project of Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, which is exactly what he's trying to do, to bring those two together in the works that he left. We see that, and there are many other thinkers too, but we spoke about it kind of indirectly and in passing. Taha Abdul Rahman and others do a lot of that too. Then we spoke quickly also about the need for the intellectual to be socially and politically engaged. And we saw that in the majority of cases, in the writings, when the topic would come up, in the majority of cases, it's almost like there is no question to be asked. Islamic thinkers, to them, it should go without saying that of course you're going to be politically engaged. Of course you're going to be socially engaged. And this is where you see the Islamic background, as opposed to in the West, where this is a major question and there's a whole serious thinking that is required to decide whether you should be engaged in doing something about the knowledge you have or not. We're not saying that all of them became politically or socially engaged, but there's a general agreement in one way or another. The majority of them, in the way they were writing, they were basically saying, this is my way of being engaged. I'm already saying more than I should. I'm putting myself on the line, my career on the line, and some of them actually went much further and they became fully engaged right from the beginning. We spoke about Izzat Begovic, we spoke about Muhammad Iqbal. They were fully in the political world in parts of their lives. And we saw those who attempted, even though they were not perhaps as successful in that, Abdul Wahab al-Masiri and others, they were politically engaged, right? Or at least feeding into that political presence in society. And then we can move from all of this, maybe the last point, I'll mention it quickly, and then we can move including in the social and political engagement. We saw that there's an importance that many of them gave to having as much awareness as possible of what you're doing. Before I become engaged, I have to have an awareness and an understanding of the world in which I live, an understanding of the power structures and how my work feeds into certain things, goes against or becomes in the interest of and against the interest of another. All of that is part of the general awareness that is required and that many of the thinkers were highlighting as perhaps missing. There are people who want to act, but because they lack the awareness, their actions are not going to be in the right way. They're not deep enough or strategic enough or in the right place. They should put their energy more here as opposed to there, from their point of view. And this came up in different ways and by different thinkers. Al-Afghani spoke about this, and so to him, for instance, the way to deal with that is understanding the importance of unity, that should come at the expense of everything else. If Muslims just unite, then that will go such a long way in dealing with a lot of these issues. That unity by itself will resolve it. So that takes awareness. He's reacting to something. He's saying that there are intentional efforts that are leading to disunity. If you understand that, how can you just feed into it? How can you just contribute to it in everything you do? Fight it. Find every way you can to fight that, because the enemy has already identified this as your weakness. Right? So for instance, that's a whole discussion. There's a whole other discussion by Al-Jabari. Bin Nabi was speaking about this, Malik ibn Nabi. Shari'ati spoke about this idea of the awareness, and he said this is one of the main, all of them are kind of in agreement of that, this being one of the main roles of the intellectual, is to raise the awareness. You are the one who at least is educating the masses so that they know how to act, even if you are not going to be the one acting yourself. We spoke about Malcolm X, we spoke about Tariq Ramadan, and we moved to those who actually engaged in political activity. And then perhaps the last theme, and then we'll turn to our community. The theme of identity, understanding who we are, understanding how we fit into the world, understanding the heritage that we have, and the relationship. So you take a position towards the West that is well informed, strategic, well thought out. And so a few of the thinkers focused here. Abdul Wahhab al-Masiri, many of them with what we could, consider to be an intimate understanding of the West, or tools in place to understand the West, or to dissect and analyze the West. Abdul Wahhab al-Masiri is one of them. Hassan Hanafi, you'll remember the whole science that he tried to create called Occidentalism, that is in reaction to Orientalism, right? We are going to study the West just like they study us. We're going to see what makes the Western mind. Why is it the way it is? Why do they act this way? And perhaps when you bring it down to an object, a specimen of study, suddenly it loses a lot of its sacredness and this idea or aura of superiority that it may be granted falsely. Suddenly you see that, no, it's actually not as great as it may seem or we're led to believe. For instance, Taha Abdul Rahman does the same thing, and we spoke about Tariq Ramadan specifically about this idea of the identity of the Muslim living in the West as a minority, how to be engaged while maintaining your origins and background and values and so on and so forth. Now, with all of this, we come to our own communities. First, I think there is, after having gone through all of these thinkers who spoke about the figure of the intellectual in the West, I think there are things that we need to draw as conclusions. There are things to be learned from that. The first is learning to be objective. To actually be able to look at realities, a figure like the intellectual, for instance, as important as it may be, crucial, influential as it may be, and be able to say, this is right, this is wrong. This is strong, this is weak. This needs to be improved, this does not need to be improved. This ability is extremely important. Before we can fix ourselves as communities, we need to learn how to be objective so that when we put the mirror to ourselves, we are able to actually identify objectively where the weaknesses are, where the issues are, where the shortcomings are. Because otherwise, it also leads to, and this is another issue that always emerges often in our communities, it leads to an inferiority complex. As though we can never be, we will always be less. We can never be that good because this is how we are, and this is completely fatalistic or cynical, pessimistic way of thinking. This is not the point of being critical. That's why we say you have to be objectively critical. Be objective. A true objective assessment of what the shortcoming is, and then solution-oriented. What the issue is and what is the fix to it. What do you propose as a solution? I don't stop at the problem. I haven't contributed anything of just pointing out another problem. I have to be able to say, this is how we move towards a solution. It may be right, it may be wrong, but there's an attempt towards a solution, because we have to be solution-driven, solution-oriented when we are being critical and looking at where the shortcomings are. And so this will also apply to, for instance, in the West, something that perhaps others were considering to be a sacred figure. In the West, the intellectual became a very sacred figure because they were leading the charge with the new values and the new beliefs of the world. So to come and just attack the intellectual that way, as many did, it takes courage to be openly critical of a figure that is supposed to be the representative of all of these good and nice and progressive and right ideas. It's not easy, but there's something to learn from that. That's one. And so here specifically, the intellectuals were recognized as being experts, true, but that by itself was not considered enough. Those who were critical of them were saying that you may be an expert, but you may not be an expert in everything. And that expertise by itself does not make you better or worse. Yes, you're an expert, and I recognize your expertise in your field. In fact, this may play against you, right? So you're not going to make them sacred, right? You're not going to grant them an exaggerated holiness just because of the degrees they have, the knowledge they have, the brilliance they have. That's not enough. There's more expected here, and we expect it to emerge clearly. Otherwise, you will be open to critique. They're not immune from criticism, from scrutiny, and we saw that a lot with Sowell, with others when they spoke about this. They spoke about, and this is all to keep in mind, for us, I'm not going to go very far, I think we all connect the dots. For instance, the elitist attitude of some intellectuals, that they are disconnected from the real needs of society, that they do not have a real skin in the game, that there are no consequences to the things that they say. Maybe right, maybe wrong, doesn't matter. I just move on to saying something else after. Right? All of that was openly criticized. And all of that, I think, is entirely relevant for our communities to keep in mind. The need for expertise. And we saw that in the West, there's a whole discussion around, do we actually need experts still in this world or not? So without dragging the discussion for too long, from our own Islamic point of view, 100% there is a need for experts. That's not the question. Do we need experts in the important fields? Of course we need. 100% we need them. Even the Holy Quran says, return to the experts, to those who have experienced and deep knowledge about those topics. This is well recognized. There shouldn't be an issue about that. But when the question is being asked, it means there are other issues that are leading to this question being asked. So first, is it possible for everyone to acquire advanced levels of knowledge, even though one day they perhaps were not the expert? Of course it is. And in today's world, a lot easier to do than in the past. Which means that this goes against the idea of the elitist attitude. If someone was not recognized as an expert one day, it doesn't mean that they can't become an expert. Give them 2 years or 5 years, and they will also be an expert. And their opinion will be as valid as yours, depending on how they achieve that expertise. And this is very important, and to keep in mind for our communities as well. That's one. 2, expertise in what? When we say someone is an expert, does an expert in a field where I actually did receive an education, a formation, a training that allows me to be an expert, does that automatically make me an expert in other fields? Of course not. And unfortunately, and this is going to be very delicate as a topic, but unfortunately in our communities, there is no formal criteria in place to say this is someone who has expertise in so and so, in religion for instance. There's kind of a vague general understanding that there is some sort of expertise there. But an expertise in what? Religion is so vast. Of course, no one is an expert in everything. That should be the first starting point. There's no expertise in everything. So surely you're an expert in something. What are your areas of expertise? And how do I understand that those are your areas of expertise? How do I know that? How do I validate that? By your claim, by reputation, by your work. There has to be something that shows that. Correct? That's a second point. Secondly, and this is something that we experience a lot in our communities too, that you are in a position of authority, that you are in a position where you have expertise, you recite majalis. Does that make you an expert in all matters of religion? Of course not. That you have expertise in some areas of religion, fiqh for instance, law. Does that make you an expert in every other area of religion? No. Does that make you an expert in areas beyond religion? You may be an expert, but not necessarily. Correct? And so this is where in our communities there has to be a little bit more scrutiny. We have to have the right expertise required for the right type of work. And in today's world, where every word we're saying is being recorded and broadcast and remembered and spread, the person who is speaking on behalf of religion, they are a representative of religion. So when I sit here and I speak and I say that this is Islamic, an Islamic lecture, an Islamic piece of knowledge that I'm sharing, either I'm an expert in what I'm saying or I'm not. This is why we say, well, let's position it first. Did I claim to be an expert, or I'm simply delivering a lecture? I put some points together and I presented those. This does not make of me a religious scholar and an expert in religion. This makes me an expert in delivering lectures. It doesn't mean that I have reached a point where I can start to present my own opinions and theories and thoughts about every Islamic matter. So when I sit here and I start talking about Islamic knowledge, that knowledge needs to be validated. And today, this is very in flux and very ambiguous. It's a very gray area. 1. 2, when I start talking about things beyond my religious expertise, especially if it's non-religious knowledge, which has to happen because there's a social need for it. So now when I'm talking, the issues that the speakers will fall into if there's no expertise, I'm going to just summarize it into 2 main issues. The first one may be that what they deliver is going to be shallow, superficial knowledge. So anyone who has read one book or attended a few lectures or gone to university and studied a year on the same topic, when they listen to this type of lecture that is, today we're going to talk about so-and-so sociological theory or issue, and you see that what the Islamic speaker has to present is not even up to par in depth, in insight, in relevance to what you already know, and you don't even consider yourself to be an expert in this field, you start to say, well, I don't think there's anything of relevance for me here. It doesn't go far enough. This is superficial. This is cliches. This is what everybody knows. Give me something more that I can use. And the bigger problem is when I say something, because I'm not an expert and ill-prepared for this topic, and I say something that contradicts what the expert says, goes against, and I don't show. I'm not presenting it in a way to say there's a general understanding of something and I'm going to rectify it with these arguments and with this knowledge. No, I'm presenting it as this is my understanding of it, and my understanding does not match reality. There are mistakes. It's not accurate. And so this is how we lose the audiences. This is how the ambiguity, this gray zone of who is an expert and in what, is leading to those who have a little bit of knowledge in the fields, those who are even a little bit educated in certain fields will start to disconnect with religion. Because those who are supposed to be the representatives and the voices of religion are not carrying this responsibility with the awareness required. So either the content being presented is too superficial, it does not address the real needs and the real issues, or it's not even accurate. And so you lose an entire generation of people. They'll give you a few chances, they'll move on to the next speaker and they'll give them a few chances, and then at some point they start to see, well, this is what the experts say. And it's either not relevant and not deep enough and not connecting. So I have to, if we're lucky, I have to do my own research and my own studying and reach my own conclusions. Or it's not even accurate. And so I start losing trust in that whole segment of the experts. In any case, that's a whole discussion. The need for raising awareness in our communities. This is where the intellectuals have to play a greater role. So as communities, we need to expect that from the intellectuals. That we understand when I'm performing any action, by living my life, my lifestyle, my thinking, what I watch, what I wear, how I live my life, my day-to-day life, what am I contributing to? The more you are an intellectual in the true sense, the more you should be able to contribute to my awareness of this. This has to be part of our general understanding that we need deep thinking. We need to raise the level of awareness in our communities at the level of the deep thinking, not the superficial day-to-day routines. That is already secured. We need to work at a deeper level of thinking. And this is the role of the intellectuals. Now to the community. In short, in our communities, from everything that we said, we need to create a space for intellectuals and intellectual thought. Whether we actually have intellectuals or not, we need to create a space for intellectual thought. For all those who want to engage, because our claim is we all need to engage in intellectual thought about our religion and our day-to-day lives as a community, as Muslims living in the West in a community. There's a need for a space there, a platform, a way for people to come together. I'm not meaning space in the physical sense. A space in the community, a way in the community for people to come together around intellectual thought about religion. So the need for intellectuals is that they are part of the community, intrinsically part of the community, not disconnected from, not the disconnected, elitist, segmented, isolated, siloed intellectuals that everybody has been complaining about. And when everybody, as we said, is complaining about something, we can't pretend that it's not there. So we have to tell the intellectuals, you are absent, and you are elitist, and you are disconnected. And to the intellectual, I will come back to say to the intellectual, but I can say it now. Why are you waiting for an invitation? Are you not part of this community? And of course, we have to tell the community, create a space where you nurture the intellectuals and allow them to come with their expertise, recognize their expertise, and invite them. So if the community is not inviting, there's a shortcoming there. But the intellectual cannot use that as a pretext for not coming and not attending and not being present. Again, not in the physical sense. Your expertise is required in the community. I have to go a little bit faster. It's almost prayer time. Again, otherwise, if you do not create that space in the community for this intellectual activity to take place, before we spoke about the risk of losing an entire generation of people, now we're talking about losing our intellectual talent in the community. If you're not nurturing your talent, that talent will go elsewhere. If they feel disrespected, not recognized, there's no space for them, they're not wanted, no one wants to hear anything they have to say, they have no opinions that are worth anything, all of that. So, education. And education means that we have to establish a foundation, understanding the importance of who are the intellectuals, what is an intellectual activity. There's a need just to start understanding what that means. That's the foundation. Two, and so that's a one-way discussion required in the society, in our communities. Now that this is in place, now we have to create the space for a two-way discussion. This is where the ideas will come up. This is where the issues will be raised. This is where together we will reach conclusions together with the intellectuals and with the religious scholars and everyone else in the community. Three, the need to rethink the roles of our centers. Is a center like this one meant for us to come together and perform religious rituals and leave, or is it meant to be for more than that? We can speak in theory what Islam intended and so on and so forth. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking for us as a community. We have to make a choice. How do we want to use our centers, our mosques and our Husseyniyat and our community centers? What are they meant for? Are they only meant for the rituals that we come and perform religious rituals? We pray together, we do the Eid together, we perform the majlis together and we leave? Or do we want to use them for intellectual centers, where a lot of this is also happening? And this means that there's going to be a place for everyone. We have to go out of our way to create a unity in the community where the intellectual feels welcomed, in fact, invited to contribute what they have. Bringing us back to the discussion we had on the family and how they belong to the community of knowledge. And in any case, all of this means that there's a need for awareness, there's a need for planning, and there's a need for support. None of this happens without these. To the intellectuals. First, the intellectuals, so now we're talking to the intellectuals. The intellectuals need to be present. They need to have a voice. They need to be active. They need to contribute their knowledge and expertise and leadership and mentorship and experience in life and all of that with the community. There's a dire need for that in the community. And you cannot wait as an intellectual to be invited. The system is too broken. The communities are too weak for all of that to happen the way it's supposed to. You either care about your religious duties or you don't. If you do, this has to be part of it. This is part of the collective engagement. You have individual responsibilities and you have collective responsibilities. Secondly, understanding that your presence is required. I won't go too far into that. Simply to say your elitism, that you are disconnected, is simply un-Islamic. That is enough for a full lecture or a series of lectures. That's not Islamic. And yes, it is difficult. You are the outsider. The way you think, the tools you have, what you care about, you are the outsider, and it's a struggle intellectually and more for you to be with the masses. It is. Tough luck. That comes with it. That's a territory. Others have other struggles and they're dealing with them. That's yours. You have to deal with it. And your presence is going to create a space where there is collaboration and there's partnerships, and it will eventually lead to a greater intellectual leaning in the community. By you not being there, of course there's never going to be any forces and drivers towards that. And also, understand your limitations. Be humble. You are an expert, but you're not an expert in everything, which means that you have a lot of work to do. Your intelligence, your education, your degrees do not make you entitled to have a religious opinion on technical religious matters. If we agree on that point, then usually there shouldn't be any issues. That's one. Two, become the lifelong student and lead by example. Why don't you acquire, with all of your intelligence and your ability, why don't you acquire religious expertise? It's never too late, and it doesn't take that long. Pick one domain. Have a structured plan so that you can come back and say, I have formal studies in this. I know my aqa'id inside out. I can contribute with this. I know my seerah inside out. I know the Quran inside out. And I add to that my understanding of my other areas of expertise, my experience in life. And this is where you're going to see that there is going to be creative, original thinking that emerges in society. And it will speak to a whole generation and segments of the population that no one else can speak to, because your contribution is going to be unique. It's going to be yours. It's not going to be cliched and repeated, just like everyone else's. Back to the community, the ideal that we should hope for is to have those who are the religious scholar / intellectual in one. The truth is, this is not a realistic expectation. It's a lot of work. It takes very unique individuals to achieve this. Which means that as a community, if we know that this is not the realistic ideal that we are going to find, that we have to create that by bringing enough people together who have all of this and they work together. Which means that as communities, we have to go out of our way to plan for this, to be strategic about it, to be intentional about it, to care about it enough to make it happen. Otherwise, it will never happen. And reality is the best proof of that. I'll simply say, for the time that we have, there shouldn't be any doubt in our minds that Islam teaches that whoever has something to contribute to, if there's something beneficial that anyone has, there's a place for them. In fact, there's a need for them. Intellectuals, with everything that we talked about, inshallah, should be clear by now. They have an incredible potential to influence and do good in the community. So we have a collective duty, a collective responsibility to make sure that these intellectuals are present and active and engaged, one way or another. If we are them, then I'm talking to you directly. If we are not them, then we can find ways to contribute to allowing them to be part of this. This becomes a community responsibility. This is the collective dimension that we kept talking about since the beginning of the series on the community. I'm going to stop here. I'm out of time. There's too much to cover left. I think this is a good place to stop for what we have been discussing regarding the place of the intellectual in the Islamic community of knowledge. Inshallah, we will wrap up this topic and move on to the next topic that we want to address within the greater theme of this series, which is knowledge and reason in Islam. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. We have 2 minutes before prayer. So there's a quick question, comment. Happy to take it, and then after maybe. The second one is inaccurate information. Both are very big turn-offs for people listening.